One last report this week before we wrap the show here, Wes. The San Antonio Spurs, let's move to the NBA draft. Jonathan Givony of ESPN went on Kevin O'Connor's NBA draft podcast for The Ringer earlier this week and was the first person to kind of broach the idea that the Spurs, who of course have the 4th and 8th picks, could be they could pursue a trade to move up to number 1. You couple that with a bunch of noise around, I think we've even talked about it with Zach Cohen, who's been doing draft stuff with us, that the Hawks, who have the first pick, seem to really like Donovan Kleen. Maybe they just take him first overall, but if they felt good about getting him at 4, this type of a trade would make a lot of sense. So, okay, could it, both sides, a little bit of incentive, maybe there's a deal there. Then you add in that the Spurs this week, not even reportedly, the dude was photographed in San Antonio, Zaccharie Risacher from France, the wing who's popping and soaring up everybody's boards lately, is in San Antonio for a workout. And you kind of put all that together, and it's like, all right, the Spurs don't think they can get Risacher at 4. They're thinking of a trade to move up to the first pick to take him, and the Hawks feel like they can stick at 4 and still get their guy in Donovan Kleen. What do you make of how real this is, if it makes sense? Is this where draft night's headed?
I don't know how real it is, but it makes a whole lot of sense, doesn't it? Where I don't think that there's there's no Zion Wembanyama prize in this draft. And everybody sort of agrees at the top of the draft, we could try to anoint somebody the best player in this draft, but there's not one. There's not some elite prospect. They're all kind of, the top 3 or 4 are pretty close together. So if there might be a lot of movement, right, in the top of the draft where teams kind of move to where they think they need to be in order to get the guy that fits their need. And for San Antonio, a guy like Risacher makes a lot of sense for them. A two-way wing, can hit open threes, has some on-the-ball juice, flash the ability to do that. Most importantly, everybody's lauding his defense. Off-ball defender, on-ball defense can use a little improvement as he gets a little bit stronger. But people really like this guy. And there's the obvious French connection between him and Wembanyama. So I don't know if San Antonio has just decided that Texas is the France of America now. There's a Paris, Texas, isn't there?
There is. There's a movie about it.
So there we go. It's not San Antonio necessarily, but they could be like the wine country or something. They got Greg Popovich there as a mascot. So I guess that's the strategy also, is let's just put all the French dudes on one team, and hey, it worked with Wembanyama and Risacher. If he is the best player in this draft, it's not a bad strategy, I guess. You're building around Wemby. There's something to be said about that.
They're in a position that I think both Atlanta and San Antonio, frankly, are in a spot where they can afford to be a little bit more purposeful with what they're doing, because they already have a player they envision as their number 1 guy. Now, maybe Trae gets traded, and that we aren't saying that in 2-3 weeks, but for now, Trae Young is the best player on the Hawks. Victor Wembanyama is the best player on the Spurs, so they can say, we like Donovan Kleen. What do we do to get him? Whereas if you're Washington at 2, for instance, you're just going to let the draft unfold and try to take the player you feel the best about, period. It doesn't really matter who you like or what fits or anything else. So it makes sense that it makes sense that these teams would be sort of thinking about it this way. I went back and looked at other trades, one of which included Atlanta, Wes, of move-ups near the very top of the draft, or moves at all. Obviously, the one we all think of, Philly, Boston, 2017, guy who's about to win a championship here. The Sixers moved from 3 to 1 in the 2017 draft to take Markelle Fultz. All they gave up, and I forgot this, all they gave up was, I believe it ended up being a 2019 first from the Lakers or the Kings, one of the two. I don't remember which one ended up conveying. That's it. 3 and that pick was all it took to get to number 1. And then Atlanta, who I mentioned a minute ago, as the secondary move to the involvement that they had with the Anthony Davis deal, ended up going from 8 to 4 to take DeAndre Hunter. What they gave up was all that year picks, but it was 8, 17, and 35. So it feels like 4 and 8, that could just be the trade. 4 and 8 for 1. That's it. and they just get the first overall pick. I mean, recent history says you don't have to actually give up a whole heck of a lot. It's not like the NFL where you're stacking all this other stuff to get for 2 spots or whatever.
And that almost feels like too much to give up, right? If I'm Atlanta, that's a no-brainer for me because you're not, 4-1 is usually a leap in sort of prospect, right? And in this draft, it feels like the top 4 or 5 are pretty much flat. You're just sort of moving around trying to figure out where you need to be to take the guy who fits your thing. So I would, if I'm Atlanta, I'm definitely doing it. The Kleen part to me is interesting. If that's the guy they're targeting, 4 is a little risky to move down because you still got Houston there at number 3.
I had the same thought.
Yep. And so maybe they'd be willing to not get Kleen. Maybe they say, you know what, if it's Stephon Castle that we end up with or Alex Sarr that we end up with or whatever, then we're willing to live with that, and that's okay because we're just not that interested in any of these guys. Maybe it's more of we don't. It's really
not Boston in 2017, right? Where they knew Lonzo was going too, so it didn't really they didn't have to worry. You're kind of putting your fate in the hands of Washington and Houston. Unless in that case, it's risky.
Unless they know who Houston wants and they feel good about Kleen being there, of course. But I don't think I think that would be really hard to figure out right now. So, maybe it's just a matter of we don't love who's at number 1, and we'd love to be able to trade back and pick up another pick here. And just 2 is better than 1 in this draft. We had 2 shots to find a difference maker as opposed to 1, even though we have the number 1 pick. So maybe it might be just as simple as that.
Yeah, Atlanta is fascinating to me because people keep pointing out this idea that, hey, don't forget, they won't tear it down. They won't blow this thing up because they owe unprotected picks, coincidentally, to San Antonio in these upcoming drafts from the DeJounte Murray deal. I think we got to get out of that mindset. I think we're going to increasingly see, similar to what we've already seen Brooklyn kind of do, where the way you're going to get out of pick hell is getting other teams' picks. And, just cycling through, okay, we don't have our picks from the DeJounte Murray deal, part 1, but what if we trade Murray and we get a couple Lakers picks or whatever team he goes to? Now those picks can kind of be our developmental track back to some sort of young depth, and we'll just kind of keep it going from there. Like Brooklyn gets rid of Harden and gets a little bit of, okay, now they have a couple of Philadelphia picks, then they lose Durant. Right. They have Phoenix picks. They don't have their own picks, but they have some sort of first-round capital either to take players or to make their next move. So I'm not convinced that the Hawks won't get a little bit worse, and maybe taking 4 and 8 this year and using next year as somewhat of a reset would be part of the way to do that. But the bigger question I
will say if they do take Kleen, would suggest that maybe it's not a complete teardown, that they could still trade one of the point guards but keep the other one, and base everything that they're doing around sort of the Kleen other point guard pick and roll. Kleen to me isn't a guy that you draft and you're like, that's the star of our future. I don't think anybody sees Kleen with that kind of ceiling. But
from the beginning, I said the Hawks should keep Trey and treat whether it's somebody they take at 1 or now in this version of events where maybe they get a couple bites at that apple, guys who fit with Trey a little bit, and you kind of reset. I mean, I compared it to like what Dallas did missing the playoffs last year. It's not a 1-to-1, but have some patience here and stop forcing it and say, okay, our core is now Trey, Kleen, and X, and great. See what that can get you rather than the Murray Trey thing, which isn't working. But I think there's a middle ground they can take where they get rid of one of the guards, but they also take a young player and they kind of have a little bit more flexibility going forward. So I think there's an opportunity. They're not as strapped as I think people are saying, but they gotta nail all the steps in between. It's not a given that they're going to do that. Spurs-wise, is there anybody besides Wembanyama that you're sure will be in San Antonio for the long haul as you look at that roster? Is there anything else you're tying down and making sure is part of your core for the future?
I'm a big Devin Vassell guy. I would tie him down. I like him a lot. Okay. I like his fit next to Wembanyama. He's aggressive enough, but also understands that it's Wembanyama's team. I thought their rating on the court together was quite good last year. Has all the makings of the guy that you want. Good defender, long, can hit threes. Just I don't know that he's necessarily a star next to Wembanyama, but I think he could be a really important player next to Wembanyama.
Vassell is one of the more interesting guys in the league, I think, next year, just because, profile-wise, he does feel like a player who should be all the things that you said, but his Shot selection is very hit or miss. He likes the pull up. He likes the pull up jumper of every kind. He doesn't really get to the basket. I think if his passing can develop, he can have a little bit more value even beyond maybe what we thought he could be in the league. Defensively, he's long but not hyper athletic, and I think we can get tricked by guys like that sometimes. So he's already been paid. They clearly like him. I would agree. He's probably close to not untouchable, but they're planning on having him on the team at least next season. I like Sochan. I think not having him be a point guard, he can be pretty effective. I actually think his catch and shoot 3 numbers were pretty solid once they stopped trying to make him the primary initiator on the team. So it's probably those 3 guys. I'm not sure if there's anything else beyond that, which just brings me to the question. I mean, okay, Risacher, great. Even if they keep 4 and 8, whatever. Generally speaking, what kinds of pieces are you looking for next to Victor Wembanyama? After watching him for a year and getting a little bit of a sense of what he might be in the NBA, although, look, all bets are still off. I'm not going to put a cap or any sort of constraints on that guy, but we at least know how he wants to play a little bit. What are you looking for? What do you want to add, whether it's in this draft or in free agency down the line?
Well, the number one thing you want is a point guard who can get him the ball so that he doesn't have to work as hard. So that's the number one thing I'm looking for. I'm also not just saying, well, we got Wembanyama, so we don't need defense anywhere else. I would lean all the way into that stuff. I would want defenders all over the court. Like a guy that makes sense to me for them is Devin Carter, maybe the best on-ball defender in this draft. Having him at the point of attack and Wembanyama at that back line would be terrifying. I think there's good defenses, and then I think there's defenses that win games. Minnesota's defense is one that win games. Can you construct a game-winning defense? You already got the most important part in Wembanyama, Defensive Player of the Year candidate, maybe even the favorite going into next year. I would be tilting everything I've got into that, and then obviously just shooting around him. I also would go find another center. I know that we all agree that Wembanyama at center is their best lineup, but I don't want that to be my only option. You want to keep him healthy. I think you're going to need to find pockets of games and pockets of the season where he's playing power forward, not banging bodies with Nikola Jokic and Joel Embiid when those guys are in town. Go find a real big-bodied center. Go spend money on Jonas Valanciunas. Just a big guy who can kind of just take those bruises so that Wembanyama at this stage of his career doesn't have to. I think that's really important too.
Side note, it's been fascinating to me just with this report and some of the other players that they've been connected to that their name has popped up so much in the rumor mill lately this offseason compared to past ones. They don't tend to be a team where you hear real stuff ever. They don't make a lot of trades. So I guess I'll just raise a little bit of skepticism that they're not just being used because they have 4 and 8, because there's a little, like you already heard that whole, like, they don't want to be bad. That's been kind of out there. I really doubt that they're going around saying that, So
right.
I'm going to hold out a little bit of fully believing what I hear about the Spurs, given their track record and the fact that they're out there so much now. I feel like it's just agents and rival executives kind of being like, well, hey, Vic's really good already. They probably shouldn't be waiting too long with him, so keep an eye out. And, what are they up to with 4 and 8? You got to, poke around there, random insider X, Y, or Z. So, but with Vic, point guard's obvious. I really do think they should be prioritizing a traditional playmaker in whatever form they can get it. So I kind of, honestly, I know, like, we all hated it. It didn't work. But the idea with Sochan did make some sense to me. Somebody who is not a score-first player who might have been able to develop into a table setter. I still think Sochan's playmaking can be a positive attribute for them, even if he's not handling the ball at all times. But whether that's Darius Garland or DeJounte Murray, whatever the trade they could make, or some guy we haven't thought of or heard of yet who becomes that for them in time, I think Vic in the post, Vic attacking closeouts, in transition, all those, a person who can set him up is going to be important. You don't want to have the ball in his hands. I think injuries and everything else would just worry me too much. So get me a guy who can really do that. I also feel, I like what you said about size. Like, I think what we saw with, and defense, what we saw with Minnesota and some other teams this year is like that, it still wins, it still is important. Yeah. And the Zach Collins, I just think he's maybe not a good enough player to be the best partner for Wembanyama going forward or even right now. But I don't think the idea is bad to why not get another 6'9", 6'10" guy just because you have a freak athlete, big body guy at center. Okay, well, Towns can play next to Gobert, and you can put a 6'10" Jaden McDaniels next to that. And, why not? If they all fit and they're all modern, versatile players, the more the merrier. So I really like the idea of just, okay, we have a generational defensive prospect. Yes, he can shoot and do all this other stuff, but why don't we make that our identity, especially because that's the side of the ball that's clearly coming along faster. If we want to win right now, it's probably going to be on that end.
Right. You want to make Wembanyama's job easier, not harder. He's your star player. Make it as easy on him to be a star as possible, not harder. Just because you have a big guy with size who's a freak athlete, all these things, doesn't mean you can rest on your laurels and be like, well, we got the one thing, and now we just have to improve these other things. No, make the job easier for him. And I'm with you that I think primarily whatever guard they bring in needs to be a table setter who can get guys involved, hopefully be a good defender, because, again, it's not enough to just say, well, we've got Wemby on the back line, he'll clean everything up. No, you want strong physical defenders who can push guys into Wembanyama when they're coming off a screen and kind of direct traffic a little bit so that Wembanyama could be even more effective. I also think that they need a perimeter scorer, which is why I think I like Vassell, because he at least showed that willingness to be that guy, that secondary perimeter scorer, sort of the Jamal Murray to Wembanyama's Jokic. You need somebody that when a play breaks down can just take a dude off the dribble. And I know Wembanyama shows some of that stuff, and he's a million feet tall, and he could just shoot over anybody, so it doesn't really matter where he shoots from. But you do, at the end of the day in the NBA, you need another guy who could take guys off the dribble and make things happen. So I would be looking for that element somewhere in my rotation, even if it's not necessarily my bona fide number 2. I think they'd still need an element of that somewhere in the rotation.
Yeah, they're an interesting team. I think they can be. I think they can be pretty good next year if they nail some things this summer. They weren't far off. I mean, we all laughed at how Denver's seeding and playoff destiny might have been affected by this team stealing a game from them the last week of the season. And that type of frisky team, regardless of if they have a generational player, those teams that compete against the best, even in, February, March, April, that tends to mean something. So I think they're kind of closer than people think, especially given all the resources they have this summer. So we'll see what they do. Maybe they just take a player at 4 and 8. That wouldn't be a bad thing, considering they also have cap space, but they're going to be in the mix for a lot if they want to be, as will the Hawks, of course, with number 1.